So we're here with Laruga, and she's going to show us in detail about Marichyasana A and some of the complications that can occur. And here she is.
Okay. All right, so first we just want to start with the placement of the legs. So we'll do right side first, which means that the right knee will come into the chest. And we want the foot to line up to the outside edge of the hip. So that means there's going to be a gap between the inside of the foot and the inside of the opposite thigh. So this alignment here of outside edge of foot to the hip is really important to facilitate the opening of the right hip. Okay, so we want to start here with the lead leg or the straight leg. We want to keep the thigh engaged, the toes active, and the heel pressing down, but the backs of the knees soft, so we're not overextending or over flexing the knee here. So we don't want to harden behind the knee joint. Okay, so sometimes I have new students hug their knee in, so you can just kind of like, or you can interlace the fingers, hug the knee in, lift through the chest. And this is good just to get further flexion in the hip joint, and also just to remind the student to really lift out of the hips and to straighten through the back. Okay, but next we're going to go into the bind. So from here we're going to thread the right arm inside the knee, and then from here reaching out and getting as much length as possible. And then as we start to wrap, this is really important when you want to drop and close the shoulder joint to get this internal rotation. So this will help get a nice tight bind. And then taking the hand behind the back and then meeting the opposite arm and catching the wrist from here. So now we're in a binding position. And so from here we want to lift the chest and get more length, and then exhale, start to fold forward. Now when we're in the position, it's important to start to square the shoulders as much as possible. So it's often that this shoulder wants to, the opposite shoulder of the bind wants to lift up. So trying to square the shoulders and then thinking heart forward toward the foot, but then shoulder blades back the neck long. And the drishti here can be toward the nose or the full drishti toward the big toe.
And when you're coming forward, are you aiming to come over the straight leg, or are you aiming to come to the inside of the straight leg with the head?
So more toward aligning your heart over the lead leg.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that requires a little bit of a shift.
Yeah,
well.
so it's a bit of a shift, but also I feel like if you have a nice base here with the foot lining up to the outside edge of the hip,
Yeah.
I feel like it tends to be easier to kind of come out and then get yourself centered over that lead leg.
And some people you see when they come forward, that bent knee comes more over the ankle, further forward over the ankle. And then other people you see it stays directly over the ankle and they come forward. So what is happening when we let that knee come forward?
Well, sometimes I think it has to do with a little bit of maybe blockage in the hip.
Okay.
As the hip starts, as you get this flexion in the hip and you're able to actually move and get your chest out further, I feel like the knee is going to stack over the ankle more in time. And I think that's just a process many students go through. I don't necessarily think it's bad unless it's causing a lot of pain or something. But I'm really big on this, lifting through the heart forward and then shoulders moving back. And so sometimes I feel like creating more space is more important than maybe just hunching over.
And how far you're going.
Yeah.
So again, leading with the chest, like you would do in most forward folds.
Exactly, yeah.
And what about if you feel as you're coming forward that bent knee hip is beginning to lift more off the floor? Should you stay where you are?
So the hip
yeah,
and the back.
so that hip at the back, sometimes as you go forwards, that hip starts to lift up more.
Yeah, it's okay if it lifts up a bit, but when it's too exaggerated, and and there's too much of a lean and it's starting to not look so much like the pose, then you need to back off a bit. But even my hip doesn't, it doesn't root fully into the floor. I don't think that's really possible. I think you know, to get further extension and opening through the hip joint, it really does need to lift a bit.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just a proportion of your lower leg to upper leg, isn't it, as to whether that will sit down or not.
Right. And I think it's important also just to think you're grounding through that hip, but it's naturally going to possibly lift, and that's okay. So I don't think about lifting the hip through this side. I think about grounding, but it naturally lifts as I facilitate the movement into the pose.
Yeah.
So.
And relative to the bind to the coming forwards, so like with most of those binds that, you know, we talk about holding the wrist, but we start maybe with holding the hands.
Yeah.
Would it be better to take a looser bind and come a little bit more forwards, or take the full bind to start with, which is maybe going to hold you up a little bit? Do you have a preference with that?
That's a good question. Oh, that's a really good question. I really like when students really start to work toward getting the wrist to get a nice opening through the chest and the shoulders. But I think it's very individual. So I think, you know, yeah, sometimes if it's starting to look a little bit awkward to really pull and go for that wrist, then backing off and going for the fingers is going to be better. And I think that's where the beauty of this, just observing the student and seeing where they are and how the shape of the pose can look more full and more aligned through each individual.
Because that can really affect the shoulder too, kind of. We said it was nice to have the shoulders straight, but particularly if you've got relatively short arms to your girth, I like that word, girth, then you're not gonna, it's gonna pull that shoulder back, isn't it?
Right.
And so maybe it would be better to have a little looser bind, but have more squarer shoulders.
Yeah, and that could work for some time, but sometimes it's good to go for the wrist and find the space.
Yeah.
But I think it's all a process. So, you know, getting that, and for students to feel the square of the shoulders, that's important. So backing off, and maybe they work there for a time, and then maybe they need to start to challenge themselves and go for the wrist and find the space over time. So I think some leeway is important there.
And the straight leg, we can see that Carolina's got she's got nice engagement on the straight leg, and she's working with the toes. Actually looks like she's about to pick up an orange or something with those toes. But some people that leg just flops out like a soggy rag, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we thinking about a particular type of energy in the foot, where it's going, or how are we working with that straight leg? Because we can get absorbed sometimes, can't we, with everything that's going on with the bind and the fold forward.
Right, absolutely. And I think you got to send some attention to this leg when you do the pose, and it's easy to ignore. So it's so important that we engage to the thigh, that we root the heel down, and then also keeping the toes in play a bit. So kind of a little bit of a spread through the toes, and the back of the knee soft. And also making sure it doesn't roll too much to the outside or too much on the inside. And it's quite common when we start to go further forward, we might compensate by rolling inside or outside. And I really feel like keeping this alignment of the leg is important. So if that starts to happen, then maybe you need to just back off.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.